Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Sanctuary, your one-stop shop for all of your fantasy needs, be it Dynasty, DFS, or Redraft. We have got you covered. Today, we are going to be walking through your Week 9 preview, every single matchup, every single fantasy relevant player that you need to know ahead of the games this weekend. And of course, we will be answering 100% of your questions live and in the comments afterwards. Tom, welcome in. We're going to dive straight in to the first matchup. Of course, it's the glamour tide. I don't know about you. It feels like this is a horror slate with about 4 good games. So we're going to get one of the good games out of the way early. Seattle at Baltimore. Your Ravens. What do you make of this one this week?
Yeah, this is the game which it feels hard to ignore in some ways because it's not only does it feature so many of the players who we love for fantasy football, your Mark Andrews, Lamar, DK Metcalf, Kenneth Walker, but there's also a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. Last week, we saw Zach Charbonnet have perhaps his most involvement that we've seen. We saw Pete Carroll come out this week and he was so effusive about Zach Charbonnet. He talked about how he just knows ball, how he gets it, how everything he does is great. So that's going to be really interesting to see how his involvement goes this week, whether Kenneth Walker loses any touches, because Kenneth Walker hasn't been doing anything wrong. We're also seeing Jackson Smith and Jigba being slightly more consistently involved. I believe it's back-to-back weeks where we've got 2 touchdowns from him now. And that is an area where if you were going to pick on the Ravens, the slot is somewhere where they have given up points at times. So that's possible. But this Ravens defense is looking absolutely fantastic in terms of in DVOA. They're first on defense across the league and 4th on offense. So there aren't too many holes you can poke in what the Ravens are doing. The biggest problem for them seems to be their ability to just shoot themselves in the foot. For me and for Rory, I know who's in the chat and watching, when you're a Ravens fan and you're watching the games, there have been so many points where Lamar seems to be trying to force the ball to Odell Beckham. These plays where Odell's on the outside or, they're going for that back corner sort of fade in the end zone, and it just isn't there. But Lamar seems desperate to get him involved, desperate to get him a touchdown. And perhaps that'll break right this weekend. I mean, the Seahawks allow the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. They allow the 3rd most to slot wide receivers. The wide receiver on the Ravens who's consistently been in the slot the most has been Nelson Aguilar when he's been on the field. But last week he played a lot less than he had been doing. We're big fans of talking about the squeaky wheel narrative on this show, and Lamar came out with an absolute squeaker of a wheel yesterday, talking about how he definitely wants to get Bateman going. He really wants to get him more targets. Bateman, for his part, he talked yesterday to reporters about how he felt like he's slowly getting back to his old self. It's easy to forget that he had Lisfranc surgery, which isn't something easy to recover from. So, yeah, there's lots of ways you could attack this. The Ravens, they start fast. They've outscored opponents by 49 points in the first quarter, which is a league high. They get down to the red zone and they tend to be quite efficient there, apart from the game against the Steelers where everything was dropped. So I think if I'm stacking this game, I'll probably lean towards the Lamar Andrews side with one of the Seattle wide receivers coming back. It's just tricky because as much as DK Metcalf is seeing good volume and seeing good red zone opportunities, still the wide receiver 27, Lockett's the wide receiver 30, neither of them quite what we expect so far. And the Ravens will have the 5th lowest wide receiver catch rate. But if we're expecting the Ravens to push them, then we have to expect at least one of the Seahawks wide receivers to be able to get there.
Yeah, I think you mentioned DK Metcalf there. He is a player that is consistently underperforming his volume. You look at any sort of metric. I run an in-season wide receiver model, and he's one of the guys that stands out of he's getting the volume, he's getting the high-value targets. I mean, the red zone usage is there. He's just underperforming it at the moment, and that could see massive regression at any point. And I think generally it probably will do. And he's the kind of player that could blow up and have a really nice little stretch of games. It's interesting you talking about those 2nd and 3rd wide receivers in this Baltimore offense. I think watching the film, Bateman looks better than I've ever seen him for the Ravens over the last 2 weeks. And as a player as someone that's been very in on Bateman over the last 2 years, I've kind of reticent to put it into the ether and talk it into real. But watching the game, he looks smoother. He looks more agile, and I think that, as you said, maybe it is that he's just getting healthy. But yeah, I'm very excited by what I've seen the last 2 weeks, but I'm also conscious I've been burned a lot over the last few years, so maybe I need to cool the jets a little bit.
Yeah, and the Ravens need that deep threat that we saw from Bateman last year against the Jets, and I forget, it was in Miami where he also broke another one, because they're one of only 2 teams in the league to have not scored a touchdown from outside the red zone. The only other one is the Falcons, and the Ravens shouldn't be in any sort of category with the Falcons offensively. And it just feels like, Zay Flowers, he was getting used a bit further downfield. Then once Odell Beckham and Rashad Bateman were back out there, now he's kind of gone to that lower A-dot sort of role again. And if you're going to do that, that's fine. But to create space for Flowers when he gets the ball, you need somebody opening the top up at the back end of things. So it'd be great to see Bateman get a couple of deep shots. And I think, the Seahawks safeties and secondaries, they're a good group. They're definitely not an easy team to pick apart, but yeah, I think there's plenty of reason for optimism that we'll get a good game out of this one.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to dive across to the next matchup. So this is the Germany game. It feels like everybody in America is fuming right now that we're getting this game stupidly early over there. It is perfect for all of us. 2:30 on a Sunday, ideal time. I'm very excited to sit down and watch it. Tom, it's a shame this game's not on the main slate because I feel like it could be one we're attacking. But for your redraft leagues, maybe even for that showdown matchup, is there a particular player, a particular matchup that you're looking forward to?
It's Tyreek Hill's revenge game. There's certain players who they want to go out and have big performances. When Hill left the Chiefs, there was a lot of people talked up the fact that he was going to play with a lesser quarterback, and Hill, for his part, he's continuously bigged up to her. And now this is one of the most fantastic offenses in the league. They're both top 5 offenses in DVOA, so I fully believe that we can see plenty of offensive production. It'll be very interesting to see how the Chiefs try and stop Tyreek Hill, because their pass defense has been very good this season as well. Like, they aren't the kind of Chiefs defense that we've seen over the last few years where sometimes it can be a little bit weak. Kansas City, they're 3rd versus wide receiver ones. So if you look at that's in DVOA metric. So if you look at that on paper, you'd say, okay, Kansas City should be able to clamp Tyreek down, and then they rank 24th against wide receiver 2s. So in theory, perhaps it's a Jalen Waddle week. Jalen Waddle last week racked up more receiving yards than Tyreek Hill. I think Tyreek Hill left the game briefly for a bit. And then on the other side of things for Miami, their defense, it's not been a strength this year, but it's getting healthier. They've got Jalen Ramsey back. Xavier Howard should be playing this week. I think that you can't forget how much of a help that is going to be for them trying to deal with the Chiefs. But really, Tyreek Hill gave the quotes today. Look out for Travis Kelce. All you've got to do is look out for Travis Kelce. I think last week and the week before, we've seen Rashee Rice have over 60% snap share in back-to-back weeks, and he's kind of really growing into that. Yeah, he's growing into that wide receiver role because the Chiefs just have nothing else there. Pacheco, RB18, it was a disappointing game against the Broncos, but sometimes we kind of take it for granted that these divisional games can be a bit funky, even against a team who's been as bad all year as the Broncos have been. I think you probably have to start Raheem Mostert if you need to. He's the RB5 on the season in points per game. It has dropped off over the last couple of weeks, and it seems like they're maybe pushing an effort to try and get Jalen Waddle going in that spell. But Mostert has been brilliant this year. I think, he's definitely going to have opportunities if the Chiefs are trying to really look after Tyreek Hill and take him out of the game. So, yeah, it doesn't feel too difficult to interpret this one.
Yeah, I think for me, Mostert's a must start. Like, I don't think, unless you're absolutely loaded, I'd be shocked if you can get away from Mostert this week. He's running back 13 for me in my ranks this week, and I think that's, that there's going to be enough volume there. The thing I'm really excited about this game, and it's probably not necessarily fantasy relevant, is this Miami offensive line. It's become a bit of a joke, and I've become a bit of a troll of myself saying Miami can't beat anybody good. But the reason they can't be any good is that their offensive line is horrendous. They have got 4 below average starters at the moment because of the injuries that they've got. And I think that depending on what Chris Jones and the Kansas City front seven are going to do, is going to dictate what's going to happen in this game. If they can't hold up, it means that Tyreek's not going to be able to get open deep because Tua's not going to be able to hold the ball long enough. It means that we're going to have to see that A-dot shrink, and therefore it's not going to be as high-value touches. So I'm praying that the Miami offensive line can hold up enough that this game can be the shootout that we're all hoping of and all dreaming of, because it could be really, really interesting. Somewhat of a glamour tie, shall we say. We've got quite a few people in the comments. It's amazing to see. If you are watching live, get your questions in, get your comments in. We're going to answer a few of them now, Tom. So Derek in the chat asking, are we dropping Palmer for Johnston? So I guess that's Josh Palmer for Quinton Johnston, I'd guess.
I think one thing that was kind of glaringly obvious last week was that Josh Palmer wasn't healthy. And, he was in and out of lineup. He probably shouldn't have played that game. And it kind of forced their hand to get Quentin Johnston involved. And he had his most productive game that he's had in the NFL so far. I think if you need points this week, I would feel more comfortable starting Quentin Johnston. But, we'll get to that game later. Like, the Jets are nobody's fool on defense. I think I'd still be looking to see if I could find a different matchup that I could take advantage of instead.
Yeah, absolutely. Jets are allowing the fewest points to wide receivers. So, I wouldn't start either of them this week. And I think that, to me, I still believe Palmer's got the role long term. Dan, one of our YouTube members, he's asking Tajay Spears, Alexander Mattison, Latavius Murray, Odell Beckham, Curtis Samuel. Start who? Well, Curtis Samuel's looking like he's not going to play. So I'd rule him out immediately.
Latavius Murray we can rule out because of the Fournette signing, I think.
Yeah, I think Alexander Mattison's the one must play. It comes down to Odell versus Tajay. And I'd lean Tajay Spears.
Yeah, I'd lean Tajay Spears too. I don't feel confident enough in when we can predict anything with Odell Beckham.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Bryce is asking thoughts on Deontay or Amari Cooper. This is Deontay's smash for me. I've got him as a top 15 wide receiver this week.
Yeah, I'd absolutely be on board with that. Amari Cooper has had some really positive points. I put him in this week's DFS write-up in our Discord, which is for our YouTube members only. If you want to join, hit that join button below and you can access the full write-up there. But for me, given a straight choice between the two, it'd be Amari Cooper. And if you're happy with these answers, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We need to hit 1,400 this weekend.
Absolutely. We'll dive across to the next matchup. Tampa Bay at Houston. Few people facing injuries. We're looking like Dameon Pierce. News broke just before we came live that he's unlikely now to play Sunday. Does that change your thoughts on this matchup?
I've got Dameon Pierce in my home league, and honestly, I'm overjoyed at the fact that I don't have to play Dameon Pierce this week. Last week, watching the Texans get down to the inside the 5, and Dameon Pierce get that touchdown after like 3 attempts. It got called back on a completely inconclusive replay, and then the fullback takes it in for a touchdown. Okay, fine, that happens. But then they get back down there again later on in the game, and Dameon Pierce should have had a touchdown, but the fullback, again to blame, decided not to block his guy, and Dameon Pierce got stuffed. So, yeah, it's tricky. What we've seen from Devin Singletary is he's been playing more than we would have liked. So, for me, it's kind of easy to go. Dameon Pierce is pretty much droppable in redraft at the minute, particularly if he's going to miss a week and you need to in shallow benches. He's the RB43. What we saw last year just doesn't exist under this offense with Bobby Slowick as the offensive coordinator. They're just not counting on Dameon Pierce the way that the Davis Mills Texans had to last year. And CJ Stroud, yes, he's kind of come back down to earth a bit with 3 sub-16-point games. But there were some tricky matchups in there. New Orleans, we knew that game was going to be a tough one. Whereas Tampa Bay, I definitely don't think they're as tough as they used to have a reputation through the passing game. They've allowed the 5th most passing yards per game. They've let a bunch of wide receivers have really good performances. Nico Collins is another player I wrote up in the DFS column this week. So I like that. I think the Bucs wide receivers, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, are too expensive for me at over 7K. It's an ugly slate, and perhaps one gets there. Baker 36. 2.2%. It's just not enough. He flashed at the start of the season and then he's regressed in various statistics since. I'd feel much more comfortable playing Rashad White, who, even though he's still very poor in the running game, I think he's at like 3.3 yards per carry when last year he was at 3.7. He's making up for it in terms of the targets and the receiving work like we thought he would. He gets 4.3 targets per game, which is fourth most among running backs. So if you're looking for a bit of a small, cheap stack in DraftKings this week, CJ Stroud, Nico Collins with Rashad White as the bring back makes plenty of sense, and it helps you get the money to be able to play someone like Alvin Kamara or AJ Brown, one of those kind of real studs.
Yeah, I love that. You don't need to convince me much to start Tank Dell and Nico Collins at the moment. I feel like I've very excited about those. I think the Tank Dell and Nico Collins is a really interesting dynamic because I don't know about you. We had the injury to Tank Dell, the concussion. We had the bye week. It's been a slow couple of weeks for Nico Collins as well. I feel like both of them are criminally underrated at the moment. I think that people are forgetting how good they were for that first sort of 4 or 5 weeks in the season and how good this offense could be for the next 2, 3, 4 years with CJ Stroud and those two receivers. I think if you're looking in dynasty circles, I think if you can go and sneak Nico Collins for, and frankly, anything less than a mid-first, I think that's a smash. And I think Tank Dell, I honestly think you can probably still get him for a second right now. So, yeah, I love those two as kind of, it's not buy lows because I think it's just almost like buy because people have forgotten about them.
Yeah, definitely. I've got Nico Collins on a rebuilding team and I'm quite stacked at wide receiver, and I've looked at trying to move him. And what I've found is that people generally don't want to pay the first round pick for him. And it's a little tricky getting that because people kind of haven't seen quite enough. But I mean, yeah, he's the wide receiver 16 in points per game. Yes, he's had a couple of kind of down weeks, but on the whole, he's been very impressive. I think your point about what this Texans offense can be over the next few years is a fantastic one. And I'd be very happy to have Nico Collins on a dynasty team as my wide receiver 3 or possibly even wide receiver 2 over the next year, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Some more questions in chat. So Dan's come back and said, would we start DJ Chark or Donta Foreman over Tyjae Spears? Foreman, yes. Chark, no for me.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah. Derek's back. He's got another question. He's saying send Chris Olave and Raheem Mostert for Justin Jefferson, Aaron Jones. He's 6-2. He's got a pretty loaded roster, quite frankly. So I guess it's a kind of a bullying move of I'm loaded, I don't need the wins. Would you do that?
Yeah. The only thing I'd say is if you can get Justin Jefferson instead of Aaron Jones, see if you can get somebody good, like, a tight end or Aaron Jones, whether it's injury or whatever. I mean, we'll get onto the Green Bay game next, but like he's been completely unimpressive. And I think that the Green Bay offense is going backwards. If you can find a tight end that maybe gives you a bit of depth because you're stacked at running back already and you've got good wide receiver options, then I'd be more intrigued by that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Cam's following on from our Nico Collins point. He's saying he bought for a mid-first, pretty quiet since then. I think that's still a good long-term play, absolutely. And then Rich, one of our other YouTube members, he's saying he's got a few shares of Aiden O'Connell on some taxi squads. You holding or selling for a second?
I think I'd sell for a second. I think, what we saw from Aiden O'Connell was interesting. It was kind of okay, but I don't think there was enough there to suggest that he could even start every game for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think for me, with all of these, you can answer this question across all of these kind of spot starting backup potential QBs, whether it's Jaron Hall or Aiden O'Connell or, frankly, Josh Dobbs or anything like that. I think their value is a third. I wouldn't sell for a third. I think that the chance that they could be more, I need a second. Aiden O'Connell, if I can get, a second round pick for him, I think that has, even at like a 15 to 20% chance of being something, I think that's a higher chance of being something than Aiden O'Connell has, quite frankly. And then we've got some more questions. I'm loving this. Loving that you're all active in the chat. Get those questions in. I want to answer you. I want to help you. He's Rory, another one of our members. He's saying Addison or Lockett. I presume that's this week.
It's a tricky one with the Vikings wide receiver situation. I think I'd probably just lean towards Addison, but it's really close.
Yeah, I think I'd go Lockett just because I don't know why, but I seem to be a lot lower on Jaron Hall than everybody else. I think everybody else seems to think that he's going to be decent. I've got very low expectations, so yeah, not many hopes on that. Moving across, the Rams at Green Bay. Now, this feels like this matchup could all pivot on whether Matthew Stafford's going to be able to play or not. We were having a chat before we came live. Do you think that he's going to sit out a week, got the bye next week, and that makes this matchup one we don't really want to touch?
It would make sense. It's going to be a cold weather game up in Green Bay. I assume that having a thumb injury in cold weather probably is less than ideal. We know Matthew Stafford is a tough guy. We know that he doesn't like to miss games and he plays through injuries a lot. But for the Rams, I mean, the Rams are probably looking at trying to sneak in on a wild card place to the playoffs. I don't think it makes sense to go out there now and risk aggravation when, frankly, you could put Brett Ripien, the backup quarterback, you could put him in and possibly stand a chance against this Green Bay team who don't seem to be able to avoid, getting out of their own way. I think what we saw from Green Bay early this season was incredibly impressive. Jordan Love was driving the ball downfield, not completing many passes, but it was enough and it was fantasy relevant. And what we've seen is that regressed as you would expect it to. He's now the QB 14, Luke Musgrave's tight end 26, Aaron Jones RB 30, Romeo Doubs wide receiver 40, Christian Watson is at 8.5 points per game over the last 4 games. And it's tricky because you want those home run hitters in your lineup. And if you bench Christian Watson and he goes off for a slate breaking kind of score, you're going to be kicking yourself after taking the L's that you've taken for the last 4 weeks. But I just don't view him necessarily as startable, even in this game against the Rams defense that has kind of regressed slightly over the last few weeks. Cooper Kupp, I'd be starting Cooper Kupp. I know it's been rough. He's had 17 targets and only 6 receptions over the last 2 games. But when you look back over the course of his career, this is the first time that he's had back-to-back games with less than 30 yards. Like, this is the first single-digit performance he's had in the last 2 years. I think that even if Matthew Stafford's out, I'd have enough confidence in him that I'd be starting him. The Rams running back situation, I'd still start Darrell Henderson. Royce Freeman seems to be mixing in, but seems to have less of a role than Henderson. Tyler Higbee has been pretty uninspiring. He's tight end 21 in points per game. If you need to start him, I guess you could start him. Perhaps Brett Ripien comes in and sort of, takes those layup shots. But yeah, and just the Green Bay Packers running back room, like I said, Aaron Jones, 1 double-digit performance this year. He's had back-to-back games where he's only had 11 touches in each of them. Normally, we'd expect that to be much closer to 20, but whether he's still injured or they just want to try and get A.J. Dillon, who's a completely ineffective backup-level running back, involved, I don't know. But whatever's going on, it's not working particularly great for the Packers.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I'm looking for the Packers to do is we've got all these young options. We've got almost too many options. I feel like we need to just streamline it a little bit. And they're going to say, right, we're going to be an 11 personnel offense. We're going to run with Musgrave, Reed, Watson, Doubs, and Aaron Jones. And let's see if we can get that and drive that forward. I think Luke Musgrave, we saw some hype early in the season. He had the concussion. He missed a few weeks. I'm intrigued to see if he's going to help kind of bring that spark into this offense. I think that would be really interested. Cooper Kupp, you said you got to start him. I think, look, if you're Brett Ripien, you're probably out of your depth. What are you going to do? You're going to feed the ball to the guy that you know is always open, and that's Cooper Kupp. So, yeah, the targets are probably going to be pretty low quality, low value targets, but I think he could see a high volume. And on the Brett Ripien, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say on Cooper Kupp, this stat via Sharp Football, the Packers struggle against slot receivers, allowing 9.2 yards per target, which is the 5th highest, and giving up a league high 9.1% touchdown rate to interior wide receivers. So everything points towards starting him.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other point is that obviously the Packers have just traded away Rasul Douglas, the corner. I know we're not going to talk a huge amount about that, but that's a big piece out of this Packers secondary that is now shipped off to Buffalo. So the Packers secondary is even weaker than they've been so far through the season. But we were talking about Brett Ripien, and I think this is a really interesting point that I want to bring in here from Tarek, another one of our YouTube members. Welcome. If you want to be like Tarek and be a member, hit that join button. He's saying basically we're getting all this hype around these spot start rookies that we've not seen. He's saying, is it a new phrase, Purdied, because of the success he had last year from nowhere, and people are always clamoring for that next guy?
I think so. And I think it's always, there's something about the quarterback position in general that people like to romanticize. And it's, probably goes back to like the Tom Brady pick in the draft and stuff, that guys can come out of nowhere and they can have these games. Look, like Tyler Huntley a couple of years ago was being bigged up as the next big thing, and that all these teams should trade for him. And really, it comes crashing down sooner or later. The thing we've seen with Purdy is that Purdy deserves more praise than he possibly gets, but it's also that Shanahan system. If any of these players were playing in the Shanahan system, as we've seen over the years, is really friendly to the quarterbacks, then I'd have a bit more faith in that kind of situation. But Sean McVay's offense probably isn't as quarterback friendly as that. I mean, he likes things done in a very specific way. Yes, Baker Mayfield went in last year and had that fantastic performance straight off the plane, but generally speaking, I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical of those kind of players.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I'm a numbers guy. I'm always going to lean back to that probability. And as I said, the chances that one of these late round rookie quarterbacks turns into the next Brock Purdy, we're probably looking at somewhere around 5%. The chances that that second round pick turns into a usable, valuable fantasy option moving forward is around 15%. 15% is bigger than 5%. I'm always going to take the 15% over the 5%. So for me, I think if you can get a second round pick for pretty much any of these guys, I'm happy to take that. We've seen, let's be honest, more of the preseason hyped guys, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, Aiden O'Connell, when they have started, they looked abysmal despite all the hype that they were getting in the preseason. So yeah, I'm happy to pivot, move off them, and yeah, it probably means I miss out on the next Brock Purdy, but it means I get an awful lot more second round picks than your average Joe as such. Chicago at New Orleans up next. This is just Alvin Kamara week, isn't it? Let's be honest.
I can't get away from Alvin Kamara in DFS whatsoever this week. As soon as I started looking at this slate, it was like, okay, well, everything here lines up for Alvin Kamara. The usage he's had, he's at 8.8 targets per game in his last 5 games. Bears allow most receiving yards per game to running backs. I think it's obvious that Kendre Miller isn't quite as ready as we might have hoped. Jamal Williams is not healthy enough, but Kamara is averaging 64 rushing yards per game, 45 receiving yards per game. He's finished inside the top 12 running backs every week that he's been available, and he's also finished inside the top 5 the last 2 weeks. Over the last 2 weeks combined, he's had 56 Draftkings points. It's just, he's a cheat code in that format. I think you have to lean into that. The Bears, again, are going to be without Justin Fields, so I don't think I really want to start any of those players. Cole Kmet, he's been up and down. He's had 4-10. He's also had 4. So I don't think you can rely on that week in, week out as you might want to at the tight end position. The Saints defense also allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to tight ends, along with like the 2nd lowest catch rate to the position. And there's certain tight ends who I would start in those kind of matchups. Players like Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson, Dallas Goedert. But Cole Kmet isn't a player who I think can overcome excellent defensive coverage. Derek Carr, I'd call him a fringe starter this week on DraftKings in terms of Superflex leagues. You should feel pretty confident plugging him in as your QB2 or even QB1 if you're hit by bye weeks. He's had 4 games with over 15 points in a row. And even though he's not the most accurate downfield quarterback, he drives the ball downfield, but he also takes all these layup passes to Kamara, who can break them for big runs. So I'm fine with that. I don't think Taysom Hill's usage at quarterback has been enough to worry me that, it's not like it was with Drew Brees at points where Taysom Hill would repeatedly come in and sort of like end up throwing those touchdown passes. So I'd be fine with that. But the Bears, they allow the fourth highest amount of drives to end in fantasy, to end in points. They can't stop teams. I think, they're 7.5-point underdogs in this game, and it's start all your Saints who you feel confident in. Chris Olave, you talked about in the Dynasty Rise and Fallers video, which is on the channel and people should check out. 1 touchdown, 517 yards. It feels like a get-right spot, but, I mean, it could just all end up being Kamara.
Yeah, I think these Saints wide receivers are fascinating this week because it's Michael Thomas is just 5 receptions for 50 yards every week. It's you can take it to the bank. He's got no upside, but he's not going to burn you. Chris Olave is screaming regression. Every single thing you look at is saying this guy is due for a massive breakout. And then you've got Rashid Shaheed, who is maybe the most boom-bust player in fantasy right now. He's had 3 top 12 weeks. Every other week he's finished outside the top 50. It's mad. I don't, short of like prime Will Fuller, I don't remember a guy that was this boom-bust and just can win you a week and completely lose you a week.
Better in best ball, that's the term for that player.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to hit you with one stat as well, Tom. Alvin Kamara, okay, receptions per game. He's currently at 7.8. There are 4 players in fantasy that are averaging more. Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Adam Thielen, and Stephon Diggs. That is it. If we're talking high floor in terms of fantasy, Alvin Kamara is averaging 8 points a week just in receptions. He doesn't even need to get any yards. That's just 8 points a week in your bank. You can cash that straight away. It's absolutely wild how he's been used. And yeah, I think it's a very exciting matchup for him. Let's dive into some comments and some questions, Tom. Cam saying he traded away Kamara in a rebuild for a second. Yeah, that's pretty painful. But yeah,
I think he did the right thing. Like I mentioned on Twitter today that I thought Alvin Kamara looked washed last year. I thought the writing was on the wall when you considered all the things that we saw the Saints do this year. And taking the second probably felt better than you could have potentially ended up with a couple of thirds if things had broke differently for him. So it feels crappy, but yeah, I mean, what can you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's one best ball team out there, Tom, where I convinced you should draft Alvin Kamara. So at least you got one share that's earned you some money at the moment, hopefully. Paul Pickin, friend of the show, he's asking DJ Moore or Garrett Wilson this week.
I go Garrett Wilson. I think put out some stats on Twitter earlier about how Zach Wilson's throwing more to Garrett Wilson this year than he did last year, and it's not been incredible, but the Chargers are a team that I'll look to start wide receivers against every week.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, Garrett Wilson, wide receiver 8 for me this week. I think he's absolute smash. DJ Moore's in that sort of back end wide receiver 2 territory. We're going to dive across to the next matchup. But before we get there, if you're enjoying this content, we want to help you win fantasy titles. That is our one aim of doing this show. Hit that subscribe button and let us help you to win those titles. Arizona at Cleveland next. Big change at quarterback for both teams, potentially. Looks like it's going to be Clayton Tune against PJ Walker, but equally it could be Kyler Murray versus Deshaun Watson. Does that change things for you, depending on who starts at quarterback, Tom?
It could be that Clayton Tune against PJ Walker might actually be the better matchup with how, Murray's coming back from the knee injury. Deshaun Watson's been just atrocious for the last couple of years. I think I'd probably feel, I don't know. I mean, PJ Walker's been okay. I think we've kind of seen enough for him that it's been fine. David Njoku's been better without Deshaun Watson over the course of the last 2 seasons. Njoku's averaging 11.04 PPR points without Watson, 8.3 per game with Watson. And I pointed this out on Twitter. That's the difference between tight end 8 and tight end 18. It's such fine margins at the position. And what we've seen is Njoku is getting more targets from PJ Walker. So I'd feel better about starting him. Amari Cooper's a fringe starter for me every week. It's been frustrating because he is the wide receiver 41 in points per game. He doesn't seem to string back-to-back games together at any point. But I don't think there's anything about this Arizona team that scares anyone. When you look at the stats, the Cardinals rank second worst in catch rate allowed to opposing wide receivers, allowing 71% of targets to be caught, those catchable targets, and they allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to the position. So I'd be starting Mari Cooper here. I think you can play Mari Cooper as a one-off in DFS this week. Jerome Ford, it seems like dealing with a high ankle sprain or low ankle sprain. Not able to play fully, but they still rolled him out there for some snaps. In terms of what you can play on the Arizona side of things, Cleveland allowed the third lowest amount of fantasy points to wide receivers, second lowest catch rate at only 51%. Cleveland allowed the fewest fantasy points to tight ends. They allowed the 11th fewest points to running backs. So, as Paul says in the chat, just avoid all Cardinals this week unless you really have to. Even Trey McBride coming off a 25 PPR point game, I don't think you can start him against this Cleveland defense on the road.
Yeah, I think the one player I want to touch on that I think you probably gave a little bit short shift to, Jerome Ford. 22 of his 26 snaps last week were in the third and fourth quarter. When the game was on the line, when the Browns needed to try and win the game, they turned over to Jerome Ford. And I think that speaks massively in terms of his potential fantasy implications moving forward. I think that he is still the 1A in this backfield. And I think that another week to hopefully get that ankle a little bit healthier, I'm expecting him to get an even bigger workload than he did last week. Yes, for DFS, it might not be a big enough workload to enter things like cash lineups and stuff like that. But in terms of your redraft, your dynasty lineups, I still think he's a solid, reliable RB2 this week and a guy that I'm touching on. Also, right. Oh, God.
I was just going to say on that, the counter argument against what I'd kind of said there would be to sort of say, okay, well, you look at the Cardinals last week and they just got absolutely destroyed on the ground by Gus Edwards. It was one of those kind of performances where they just couldn't stop the Ravens. The Ravens didn't run heavy in the first half of the game. Then the second half turned to it. They've allowed the third most fantasy points per game to the running back position. They've also allowed an average of one touchdown per game to the running back position in just rushing production. There's only two teams worse than that in terms of touchdowns allowed per game. So, yeah, perhaps I'm skirting over Ford just a little bit, and at $200 cheaper than Hunt on DraftKings, it's probably an interesting play. Maybe he's one I'll get to over the weekend and add into the Discord.
Yeah, and then Trey McBride. Last week's usage was absolutely mental. It was the best single game usage any tight end has seen this year. It was the most snaps he'd played so far this year. But to me, the biggest signal that I don't think I've heard anyone talk about this week, he lined up as a wide receiver 33 times last week. He hasn't broken 16 so far this year in terms of snaps in the slot or out wide. The fact that he is now not just a 70, 80% in-line guy, he's going to be used all over the field. That's amazing for his fantasy potential because we know those routes run from the slot are much more valuable than routes run in line. So, yeah, very excited that Arizona are finally using him as to be what they drafted him to be 18 months ago. In another question from Josh in the chat, he's saying, would you trade Lamar, Jacoby Myers, and Rondell Moore for Jalen Hurts and DeAndre Hopkins? It is a 20-man redraft league.
I don't think I would, but simply, Lamar and Hurts is 1-for-1 for me, but I think the DeAndre Hopkins stuff, you're buying high on the back of last week, which was insane, and those weeks just aren't going to be like that. I think, yes, Jacoby Myers is probably going to struggle a little more with Aiden O'Connell, but I don't know. Maybe, you've got Tyreek Hill, Christian Kirk. It just feels like wide receiver isn't a massive need there in a 20-man redraft PPR. I don't know. What you say, Rich?
I think it's a pretty even deal. I think that like Hurts and Lamar are basically even, maybe Hurts slightly ahead. Myers and DeAndre Hopkins are basically even. I think Hopkins is going to be a little bit more boom bust. I think Myers is going to be a little bit more consistent, but they'll probably end up around the same. And then you've got Rondell Moore as kind of the difference between Hurts and Lamar. So, yeah, I can easily argue both sides. In a 20-man league, I guess I'd go with the depth of the extra player and lean towards Lamar Myers and Rondell Moore. But honestly, I don't know what this trade is achieving, if I'm being brutally honest. And when one of my most common questions in the Discord whenever I'm being asked, what do you think of this trade? It's, what are you hoping to achieve? And looking at this, Josh, I don't really know what you're hoping to achieve. So I'd say maybe look for a different deal. We'll move across now. Washington at New England. Now, for me, I've been targeting Washington as a matchup for wide receivers for quarterbacks basically all year because they can't cover anyone. But now we've got New England who basically don't have a quarterback or a wide receiver that I want to touch. So are you touching this one, or is this a matchup that you're avoiding?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously we've lost Kendrick Bourne, who is ACL injury. Devontae Parker, I believe, is in concussion protocol, maybe. I might have got that wrong. But if he can't play, you're really talking Juju Smith-Schuster, who looks entirely washed, like to the point where it's incredible how much the Patriots moved on from Jacoby Myers, gave Juju Smith-Schuster a virtually identical contract, and they have got by far the worst player. Demario Douglas at 4K is going to be popular this week simply because the Patriots have consistently hyped him up, talked him up all through training camp. He seems to have done well. They've used him at points ahead of Kayshon Boutte, and it just seems like he is the player who is going to be on the field more. Realistically, you can probably lean towards Hunter Henry or Mike Gesicki if you're looking for a one-off. I think both of them probably see slightly more volume than they've seen at times this year. But for me, the interesting side of this is just the Washington side. We've seen Sam Howell, he's quarterback 11. He's very boom or bust occasionally. He's not a quarterback that I'd want to build a franchise around. But in fantasy, it's working, Jahan Dotson finally had a breakout game. He hadn't managed a single performance over 50 receiving yards, and then he had 108 last year, as well as his second touchdown of the season, 27 DraftKings points. That was more than double what he'd had in any other game. And the one thing that you can see on screen there, New England ranked 29th versus wide receiver twos. So they're top 5 against wide receiver ones. And this one just sets up for Jahan Dotson again. It also sets up for Logan Thomas because the Patriots rank 31st against tight ends in DVOA. They give up 7.7 yards per target to the position, which is 9th most. Logan Thomas, he's had that kind of target share right around 20%, hovering between sort of 17 to 20, averages 5.7 targets per game, which is the 10th highest rate among tight ends. So I think you can play him. You can play Dotson. If you want to double stack them with Sam Howell, I don't mind it. I'm not sure I can quite get there on a slate with Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts myself. But yeah, and then if you want to run it back with Demario Douglas, that's probably the most interesting one. But I wouldn't feel like you necessarily had to put any Patriots on a stack on DFS this weekend.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. Now, I'm going to completely hijack the show, and we're going to disappear into a little dynasty corner that I want to pick your brains on, Tom. Sam Howell is grossly overvalued in dynasty right now. Okay, Washington is a tire fire. We've seen them trade away 2 potential, very good defensive ends. I think they're going to bring in a new head coach next year. I think they're going to have a new offensive coordinator next year. I think Josh Harris is basically going to rip this franchise up and build it from the ground up. This is a guy that was heavily involved in the process for basketball fans out there. I don't think Sam Howell is going to be the starting quarterback for Washington next year. Yet I keep I've put out a couple of tweets the last few weeks about quarterbacks that I think have got a starting spot, quarterbacks that potentially could be out of contract and stuff like that. And everyone keeps telling me that Sam Howell's a stud and Sam Howell's got that dog in him and he's going to be great. Yeah, Sam Howell's really useful and really good for fantasy right now. He's a high-end QB2. He's great. We always knew he was going to be great for fantasy if he could keep the job. But I don't think I've seen enough from Sam Howell to buy into him long term as a dynasty asset. So I've seen talks of people paying a first for Sam Howell right now. That seems absolutely wild. Please tell me you're with me and you're kind of out on Sam Howell as a long term asset, or do you think that he's a player that could potentially have some value beyond this season?
I think what it comes back to for me is one very simple question. If you've spent over $6 billion on a sports team, are you really going to have Sam Howell be your quarterback of the future? And I think Ron Rivera has no time whatsoever. If Ron Rivera makes it through January with a job, I'll be absolutely flabbergasted. And I think that the team, if you're going to tear things down, if you're going to start accruing assets, then in my mind, they're already priming themselves ready to be able to make a move up the draft board to be able to go and get a quarterback. And I don't think Sam Howell is a bad player. I think Sam Howell has shown enough that he can play in this league for a number of years, be a backup, be one of these kind of players who was in and out of the lineup. But I haven't seen enough for me to have massive confidence in him, and definitely not the kind of level of confidence where I would go out and trade for him in Dynasty. I got Dynasty leagues where I lost Kirk Cousins this week, and I would rather go out and trade for Baker Mayfield as a 1-year rental than push my chips in on a first-round pick for Sam Howell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just comes back to me. There's a new head coach in Washington next year. For that, I'm sure. And I just can't see a world where a head coach is willing to tie his future and bet on Sam Howell as the long-term franchise quarterback. So, yeah, I think grossly overvalued. And I think if you can get a first for Sam Howell now, absolutely snatch that right up. Talking of quarterback changes, we've got two teams that have seen drastic quarterback changes. Obviously, slightly different ends of the spectrum. The horrific injury to Kirk Cousins and then Desmond Ridder finally benched for Taylor Heineke. Do you think that the Taylor Heineke could potentially bring out some more fancy relevance from, should we call it the three-headed monster that is the high drafted players for Atlanta?
Well, first of all, shout out to Kyle Pitts, who's now the tight end 15 in points per game. He finally took over Jonnu Smith, who was the tight end 16 in points per game. So the wave has already turned. Kyle Pitts is cashing in on all those kind of taking him first overall in dynasty startup leagues. That's fine. But in seriousness, this move needed to be made. Desmond Ridder was absolutely toilet over the last month. I think Arthur Smith can bemoan and bitch and complain and talk down to reporters all he likes, but sooner or later he had to accept that the team had too many good offensive players to keep going out there and putting that there. Taylor Heineke, I don't think either of us have ever been particularly huge fans of Taylor Heineke, but
I was a pretty big fan of his first season starting in Washington. I was pretty all in.
I had that the wrong way. I thought you were down on Taylor Heineke, but okay. So what we've seen from Taylor Heineke, I mean, he was more functional and a better quarterback than Carson Wentz last year, which isn't a high bar to clear. The team thought he was a better option than Sam Howell in all through Sam Howell's rookie year until the point where Taylor Heineke went and told the coaches that they should start Sam Howell in the last game of the season. He understands the locker room. You know, he talked about after the game about how this was still Desmond Ridder's team. And when I see that from a player, I just know that he's going to understand which players he should be getting the ball to. It's never been a complaint before that Taylor Heineke didn't get Terry McLaurin the ball. Sometimes we'd complain about the standard of those targets or passes, but I have faith that Drake London is probably going to see an uptick from where he is at wide receiver 44 in points per game at the minute. Kyle Pitts, I don't know. I'm still not all the way in, but I think you're talking about you can probably start him as a tight end 1 until we see otherwise. Bijan Robinson, yeah, it's been iffy at times, but I'd still be starting him every week, and I'd assume that Taylor Heineke is going to be able to check down enough to keep him ticking over nicely. In terms of his game on the whole, though, it's not one which I'd be aggressively targeting in DraftKings. I don't know anything about Jaron Hall. Like, I'll be frank, it's not a player that I ever got to, so you can fill us in on that one. But on the Vikings side, Jordan Addison, 52 PPR points in the last 2 games. He's been the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 13. It's such a shame that's probably going to come crashing back down. TJ Hawkinson, he's been a top 4 tight end in back-to-back weeks with 80 yards in both of those games. Like, that's so rare at tight end to get a tight end putting up that kind of yardage, but I'd struggle starting anyone outside of them. Alexander Mattison has 0 red zone touchdowns this year, despite having 14 attempts out. Only Javonte Williams has more. Cam Akers, he had 2 touches last week. He hasn't had double-digit touches for 3 consecutive games now. So, yeah, I don't think I'd be starting anyone apart from Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson if I had to. But yeah, talk to me about Jaron Hall. Am I being too unkind to this guy who I know nothing about?
No, I think Jaron Hall's got the tools. He's got a good arm. He can make a lot of NFL throws. He's athletic. I think he's underrated as a kind of an athletic rushing potential quarterback. He's not going to be, Lamar take off 10 times in a game, but he could add some points with some of that moving the pocket ability. But frankly, in college, he was horrendous against pressure. He took far too many sacks. And I don't see how someone who has that issue has had, 8 weeks to try and learn behind Kirk Cousins. This Minnesota Vikings offensive line has got holes across it. We see Kirk Cousins get sacked a lot.
And they just traded the guard.
Yeah, exactly that. I think that he's going to have issues. And I think that if you're relying on Jaron Hall to hold up, the fancy superstars that are becoming in TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, I'm concerned. I think you've kind of got to start them as, Jordan Addison's like a wide receiver 3 this week. TJ Hawkinson, look, tight end's such a dumpster fire that you've got to start him. But I just don't have enough faith in Jaron Hall as a player that I'm expecting anything more than a very poor return, sadly, this week. Some questions, though, in the chat. Trout Season saying, start Kareem Hunt this week or Najee versus the Titans tonight, man. Look, Tom tried to tell you about Najee Harris this year, but I bet you when you drafted him, you did not expect to be having this conversation. Tom, are you actually going to pick Najee Harris here?
No, I'm not, because the Titans have been good against the run all season. They've allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. I think Najee Harris has looked better at points in certain areas of the game than I expected him to, but in other areas of the game, he's looked awful. This profile's more like a Jaylen Warren game, in my opinion, and I would rather start him. And yeah, I'd start Kareem Hunt pretty comfortably over Najee Harris.
Yeah, I've got them ranked quite close, but I do actually have Kareem Hunt over Najee Harris as well. So I'm agreeing with you there, Tom. And then Legends in the chat saying Devontae Adams or Nico Collins this week.
I'm high on Nico Collins this week, but I think I'd kind of have to lean into that. Last time the Aiden O'Connell started, Devontae Adams had 13 targets. They might not all be catchable, but we've probably got to lean into his targets. And we'll get to it when we get to the Giants and Raiders, but I just assume that the Raiders staff who are still in the building have spent the last couple of days speaking to players like Devontae Adams and asking exactly.
I think Tom's gone, but whilst you're here, if you're not yet a YouTube member, you are missing out on so much content. You get Tom's DFS write-ups every single week. That is winning people money. You get all of my Dynasty content, my survival kit. You'll get my rookie guide, which will be over 100 pages. That'll be out in the early season, sort of February, March time. You get all of that just by hitting that little join button down below. We're going to dive across to the Indianapolis Colts at Carolina. It's an interesting matchup. Carolina obviously got